All right, let's take a deep dive into what folks are saying went wrong for the Democrats in this election. We're looking at two perspectives today.
Okay.
One from Senator Bernie Sanders,
Mm-hmm.
and the other, a super in-depth article from Qasim Rashid. He's a human rights lawyer, and really interesting analysis from both.
Yeah, and you know what's fascinating is that both of them are kind of pointing at this idea that Democrats, lost their way a little bit, like they've been prioritizing compromise and power maybe a little too much at the expense of their core values?
Yeah, it's like, so they're both looking at the same patient, diagnosing the same illness, but coming up with totally different treatments.
Exactly.
And Sanders, his statement, it's classic Bernie, right?
Oh, yeah.
Super direct,
Hmm.
to the point. He's saying, basically, the Democrats have abandoned the working class, and this is the price they paid.
And he doesn't just say it, he really lays out the evidence. He points to 50 years of stagnant wages, growing inequality, no universal health care, no paid family leave, all these issues that directly hit working families.
Right. And he's like, hey, these are basic needs, and the Democrats haven't delivered.
Right.
And then he asks this, like, really pointed question. Will the Democratic Party learn from this loss, or are they just going to keep, catering to big money interests?
It's a good question.
Right. It really cuts to the chase, right? Like, have Democrats gotten so focused on winning that they've forgotten about who they're supposed to be fighting for?
It's a good question to ask. And Rashid, his analysis goes a different direction. Instead of these big systemic issues that Sanders is talking about, he picks out very specific decisions, actions that he thinks led to this loss.
Yeah, he gets into the nitty-gritty, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like dissecting the whole campaign and pointing out what he sees as the big mistakes.
Yeah. He starts off with Biden's promise, remember, to be the bridge president. Just one term, make way for a new generation of leaders.
Right.
Rashid argues that breaking that promise and then not having a real primary really hurt Kamala Harris.
Interesting.
He compares it to 2008 with Obama, 2020 with Biden himself, those really tough primaries.
Mm-hmm.
He says going through that, it tested them, it made their message stronger, it made them better candidates by the time they got to the general election. Harris didn't get that.
She didn't have to go through that fire.
Exactly.
And Rashid, he brings in some data about voter turnout, saying that it seems like when you have a really competitive primary, more people vote overall.
Yeah.
So his argument is that, without that primary battle, Harris was kind of at a disadvantage right from the start, and maybe the whole party suffered because of it. And, I think about the voter turnout this time, it was way down.
Makes you think, right? About trying to control everything so tightly, avoid any conflict in the party. Maybe there's some unintended consequences there.
Right.
And speaking of avoiding conflict, that leads us to Rashid's next point, which is he really slams Merrick Garland for not prosecuting Trump for January 6th.
Yeah, this part really jumped out at me. He brings in this quote from way back in 2022 by Dino Baydallah. He was warning, if Trump doesn't face consequences for January 6th, it could be the end of American democracy. And, well, here we are.
Right.
Kind of chilling to read that now. Do you think Garland not doing anything emboldened Trump and helped him make this comeback?
I mean, it's impossible to say for sure, but
Yeah.
it's a question worth thinking about, right? I mean, Rashid's argument is that by not holding Trump accountable and Biden not really talking about it much either, it created this feeling that, there were no real consequences for what he did. And maybe that helped him get back in power.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, were the Democrats so worried about looking bipartisan, not upsetting moderate voters, that they missed a chance to really stand up and say, this is wrong, This is about democracy.
Yeah.
Would that have fired up Democratic voters? I mean, could it have changed things?
Maybe. It's a question we'll be debating for a while, I think.
Yeah, for a long time.
Yeah.
Okay, so then Rashid, he gets to his third big criticism, and it kind of comes back to this idea that the Democrats compromising on their values to chase these moderate voters that always seem to be just out of reach.
Right.
He's saying they moved away from progressive policies, the things their base really wants, in this attempt to win over Republicans.
He has all these examples, Medicare for all, asylum policy, even fracking, all these areas where it seems like Democrats kind of softened their stance.
And the crazy part is, according to Rashid, all that got them was a 1% gain from Republicans, while they might have lost 30% of the youth vote.
Ouch.
It's not a great strategy, is it?
No, not really. He's basically saying they're giving up their core beliefs alienating their base, trying to win over voters that are probably never going to vote for them anyway.
So we've got Sanders saying, hey, you're out of touch with the working class. And then we've got Rashid, who's like pointing out these specific leadership failures, strategic mistakes.
Right.
But they both seem to agree that, like, something is broken, right?
Yeah, something's not working.
But where do we go from here? What are the solutions? We'll get into that in part 2.
Definitely. So, Rashid goes on to break down how the Democrats just lost these key arguments during the campaign.
Yeah, like they had some wins, but just couldn't sell them.
Exactly. And he splits it into these areas where they just didn't connect with voters. The youth vote, economy, immigration. He even brings up Palestine.
Let's start with young people, right? Like, the Democrats have always kind of counted on young people to come out and vote for them.
Right.
This time it felt different, right?
Yeah.
What happened there?
So Rashid says there was this big disconnect on issues like student debt and climate change, obviously like huge things for Gen Z. And he argues that the Democrats didn't offer any real solutions or like a vision that really connected with them.
It's almost like they were stuck in the past.
Right, using the same old playbook while the Republicans were figuring out, TikTok and all that.
So the Republicans were meeting young voters where they are.
Yeah, and he uses that example of Trump, opposing the TikTok ban, which was super unpopular with Gen Z, while Biden supported it.
Oh, right.
Like, Republicans saw that as a way to connect, and the Democrats just totally missed it.
Almost like they took the youth vote for granted.
Yeah, like, it'll just be there. And, well, they paid the price for it, didn't they?
They did. Okay, so then there's the economy, right?
Mm-hmm.
This one seems weird because, like, objectively, the economy was doing pretty well under Biden and Harris, wasn't it?
It was, yeah.
Like, unemployment down, stock market up.
Mm.
So why weren't people feeling it?
Well, Rashid's point is that the Democrats got caught up in all these, like, abstract numbers without connecting them to how people actually live.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Like, sure, the GDP's good, but if you're still struggling to buy groceries or pay rent,
Right.
it doesn't feel like the economy's working for you.
So it's like they had the policies, but they couldn't sell them.
Right. And he points to this data that poverty actually went up under Biden and Harris.
Really?
Yeah, despite all those good numbers. So it's like this disconnect between what their policies are supposed to do and then what's actually happening for people.
Winning on paper, losing in reality.
Yeah, and this inability to connect with what people are experiencing, that seems to keep popping up in Rashid's analysis. He talks about immigration being another example.
Okay.
He says instead of having like a strong plan for immigration reform, the Democrats just got stuck being defensive and arguing amongst themselves. And because they didn't have a clear message, the Republicans were able to use that to their advantage. They even made gains with Latino voters.
Almost like they were so afraid of being called soft on immigration
Yeah,
that they ended up pushing away the very voters they were trying to get.
exactly. And, Rashid calls for a more humane approach,
Yeah.
one that deals with people's concerns, but, also keeps fairness and justice in mind. He thinks they need to be like way bolder on immigration and really push back against what the Republicans are saying.
So it's not just about the words, it's about the actions too.
Yeah, they have to offer actual solutions, not just like nice-sounding phrases.
Like-
And then he gets to this issue that he really digs into, Palestine.
Okay, yeah, this one was interesting.
Yeah, he brings in this polling data showing that most Americans, and especially Democrats, did not want to send weapons to the Israeli government.
Right.
But even with that being clear, like what people wanted, the Democratic leaders didn't really budge.
It makes you wonder, like, who are they listening to? Are they actually representing what people want, or are they listening to lobbyists?
Right.
It's a tough one, and it's something they need to figure out.
Rashid says that not shifting on Palestine, it probably cost them votes, especially with younger, more progressive people who are just not happy with what the U.S. is doing over there.
So we're back to that idea of compromise, right?
Mhm.
Were they so afraid of looking weak on Israel that they, just kind of ignored what a big part of their base wanted?
It's a good question. And he says that Harris, she used to be more progressive on this issue. She could have really stood out from Biden and appealed to those voters who were looking for a change,
Right.
But instead, she just stuck with the way things were and maybe alienated some people in the process. It's like sometimes taking a stand, even if it's risky, might be better than trying to please everybody.
It's about having the courage to fight for what you believe in.
Exactly. And Rashid says, this fear of risk that's always trying to compromise, it messed them up in the end.
He has that example of Harris trying to get Republicans on her side,
Mm-hmm.
promising to put one in her cabinet, even taking an endorsement from Dick Cheney, who's like super unpopular with Democrats.
And what did all that get them? 1% from Republicans, maybe, but maybe lost them 30% of the youth vote.
Not a good trade.
No, not at all. So it's like, if you give up your values and it doesn't even get you more votes, then what's the point?
Right.
That seems to be what he's getting at. He's telling them to stop chasing Republicans and actually listen to their base for once.
Right. Listen to their own people.
He thinks progressive policies are way more popular than they realize, and that if they just stuck to those beliefs instead of trying to be, like, Republican light, they'd do much better.
It's a bold statement, and I'm sure it'll get some people talking.
It will, but it's a conversation they need to have, because if they don't change course, they risk losing the very voters they need to succeed.
Right, the ones who actually agree with them. So we've got all this from Rashid, really interesting stuff, but where does Bernie Sanders' perspective fit in?
We'll explore that connection in part 3.
Okay, so we've been digging into Qasim Rashid's pretty sharp take on what went wrong for the Democrats. But now, how does Bernie Sanders fit into all of this? It seems like they're both raising red flags, but maybe from different angles, right?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Remember, Sanders' main argument is that the Democrats have just lost touch with the working class. They haven't dealt with the real economic struggles that people are facing. Like, he keeps bringing up stagnant wages, inequality, and that there's no safety net, really.
And what Rashid is saying about the Democrats losing these arguments, not connecting on things like the economy, immigration, Palestine, doesn't that all kind of fall under what Sanders is talking about? This idea of abandoning the working class.
Oh, totally. I mean, think about the things Rashid brings up, right? Student debt, climate change, wanting a more humane immigration system, a foreign policy that actually reflects, what most Americans want. These are all things that hit working people directly.
They do.
And Sanders is saying, by not fighting for these things, the Democrats basically just handed the Republicans a win.
So it's like Rashid is focused on the symptoms and Sanders is like, here's the disease.
Exactly.
They're both saying, hey, the Democrats aren't representing most Americans, and something's got to change.
Right, and it all goes back to that theme we've been talking about, this idea that the Democrats have been putting compromise first, trying to be electable, instead of actually leading and sticking to what they believe in.
It's like they're so worried about winning that they forgot why they're even running.
Yeah.
And both Sanders and Rashid are like, that's not going to work anymore.
They're saying you can't just try to be everything to everyone. You have to stand for something. You have to fight for something.
And for who you represent.
Right, and they need to get back to the working class and what matters to them.
So what does this all mean for our listeners? What's the takeaway here?
Well, I think the big message is that the Democrats are at a crossroads. Like, they can keep going down this road, compromising, little changes here and there.
Like it's safe.
Yeah, but they risk losing even more of their base, and that means losing elections. Or they can choose a bolder path, really progressive, put working people first, give people some hope for the future.
So it's like play it safe or fight for something bigger.
Exactly.
And the choice they make, it could decide what happens to the party, maybe even the whole country.
Yeah, it's a really interesting time politically.
It is.
And we, as citizens, we have a part to play in this. We can demand more from our leaders. We can hold them to their promises. And we can work to create a system that actually listens to people.
That's a powerful message. So we always like to leave you with something to think about. Where do you think the Democratic Party goes from here? What needs to change? What are you hoping for? What are you worried about? Think about it. Talk about it.
Yeah.
And most importantly, get involved because, the future's up to all of us.
Until next time, keep diving.